She was once pushed out into the rain by the man she loved most, without a penny, without a word, only blood on her lips and laughter from behind the limousine window. They thought she was dead. They thought she was gone forever. But 5 years later, Seraphina Vale returns to this city, not to ask for forgiveness, not to beg, but to burn down everything they built on her bones. And the man standing beside her tonight is the one this city fears more than death itself. Like now, and comment the name of the city you're watching so I know how far this story has come. And stay until the end, because this is just the beginning. The rain came down hard the night Seraphina Vale lost everything she had ever built. It wasn't the kind of rain that cleanses. It was cold and vindictive, the sort that found the gaps in your collar and worked its way down your spine until your bones felt like wet concrete. Blackwater City had a talent for weather like this, punishing, deliberate, as though the sky itself had been paid off by someone with deep pockets and a grudge. The Harwick County Courthouse sat at the intersection of 5th and Meridian like a monument to everything money could buy. White marble columns, brass fixtures polished twice a week, a lobby where the echo of your footsteps followed you like a warning. Seraphina had walked those floors 100 times before, first as a guest at fundraising dinners, then as a business owner filing permits, and finally, tonight, as the woman being systematically gutted in front of a judge who refused to meet her eyes. Judge Calloway had the face of a man who'd stopped being ashamed of himself sometime in his 40s. He was 63 now, gray at the temples, reading his prepared notes in a flat drone that drained every syllable of human weight. He talked about asset distribution. He talked about corporate filings and trust structures and prior agreements. He did not look at Seraphina once in 45 minutes. She sat at the plaintiff's table with her attorney, Marcus Webb, who was good but not well connected enough, who kept touching his collar the way people do when they know they're losing, and listened to her life being parceled out like unclaimed luggage. The Astronova shares she'd personally negotiated a seat on the board for, awarded to Cross Holdings LLC. The penthouse on Rivercrest Drive that she'd spent 8 months furnishing after Damien said the old one felt like a hotel, awarded to the respondent. The joint savings accounts, structured under the Vale Cross Family Trust, a legal architecture Damien's lawyers had spent 11 months quietly constructing while she was focused on quarterly earnings, frozen, pending review, effectively inaccessible. Marcus leaned toward her at one point and whispered, "We can appeal the trust ruling, the precedent in—" "Don't," she said, and her voice came out flatter than she intended. She wasn't looking at the judge. She was looking at Damien. Damien Cross sat at the respondent's table with the ease of a man attending a dinner party he'd hosted before. Navy suit, no tie, collar open just enough to suggest he didn't need to try. He had a jaw like something carved and eyes that had always looked warm until they didn't. Seraphina had spent 4 years learning the difference between those two states. The warmth was something he switched on and off the way other men switched on a television, when it was useful, when there was an audience, when the light was right. Right now, with the judge listing everything she was losing, Damien was scrolling his phone under the table, not even pretending. His attorney, a silver-haired man named Garrison, who billed $1,200 an hour, sat perfectly still beside him, hands folded, patient as a predator. To Garrison's left sat 2 junior associates with matching postures and matching haircuts. Seraphina counted 4 total. Marcus had brought 1 paralegal. She'd understood then, in a technical way she hadn't fully processed emotionally, that this wasn't a legal proceeding. It was a performance. The verdict had been written somewhere else, in a room she hadn't been invited to, and everything happening in this courtroom was theater. Expensive, airtight, legally admissible theater. The gavel came down at 11:47 p.m. Seraphina stood because that's what you did. Her legs held. She was proud of that later, in the strange, specific way you're proud of small things when larger ones have collapsed. She was pulling her coat from the back of her chair when Damien's brother stepped into her path. Connor Cross was 2 years younger than Damien and 10 years cruder. He had the same bone structure and none of the restraint. He came from the family's money with the full confidence of someone who'd never once worried about being cut off. He smelled like bourbon and something expensive. He was smiling. "Rough night, Sarah," he said. She tried to step around him. He moved with her, deliberate, shoulder turning just enough that when she pressed past him, she lost her footing on the polished floor and her elbow caught the edge of the table. And then his hand, quick, almost casual, connected with her shoulder, and she went sideways into the wall. The back of her skull kissed the marble. Her lip caught on something, the edge of her own teeth, and she tasted copper. Cameras flashed. She hadn't registered that there were photographers in the lobby, but of course there were. This was Damien Cross's divorce, and Damien Cross didn't do anything without documentation that could be shaped into narrative afterward. She heard someone laugh, a woman, high and sharp, from somewhere near the doors. She heard someone else say her name in a tone that made it sound like a punchline. Marcus was at her arm. "Are you... Seraphina, we should... I'm fine." She was not fine. Her hands were trembling and her lip was bleeding and her skull was ringing with a low, clean note like a bell struck too hard. "Don't touch me. I'm fine." She walked out of the courthouse under her own power. That mattered to her. She would remember it afterward as one of the few things she'd done right that night. That she had walked out, upright, on her own legs, bleeding but not bowed. The rain hit her the moment she cleared the brass doors. She stood on the sidewalk with her single carry-on suitcase. She'd packed it 2 days ago when she realized Marcus's injunction wouldn't hold, and watched the line of black cars pull up for Damien's team. Garrison was already on his phone. Damien stepped out under an umbrella held by a younger man and moved toward a waiting town car without looking back. Connor was behind him, still grinning. A photographer got close and Seraphina turned her face away. She didn't want whatever expression she was wearing right now to become a headline. She already knew what the tabloids would say. She'd watched them build the narrative for months. Seraphina Vale, the ambitious social climber who married up and overplayed her hand, the gold digger who lost the game. They'd had the story written before the verdict. Damien had made sure of that too. She stood in the rain for 4 minutes. She knew because she watched the courthouse clock above the doors. 4 minutes before she made herself move, made herself find a cab stand 2 blocks east, made herself get into a vehicle and give an address. A mid-range hotel in the garment district where she'd paid 3 nights in cash before the accounts were frozen. The cab driver didn't say anything. She was grateful for that. She sat in the back with her suitcase between her knees and her hands in her lap and let the city slide past the wet window, and she did not cry. Not then. Not in the cab. She cried in the hotel bathroom with the shower running so the sound wouldn't carry through the walls, sitting on the tile floor with her back against the tub and her coat still on, and she cried until she was empty. Until there was nothing left but the kind of silence that follows total destruction. The silence that isn't peaceful. The silence that's just the absence of everything that used to be there. She didn't sleep. By 4 a.m, she was sitting at the small desk near the window, laptop open, watching news sites refresh. The story was already everywhere. One photograph kept appearing in different formats across different platforms. Her leaving the courthouse, face turned away, blood visible at the corner of her mouth, rain-soaked. Someone had given it a caption that read, "Vale's exit, end of a dynasty." Seraphina stared at it for a long time. She was 31 years old. She had no assets. She had $1,700 in a personal checking account Damien's lawyers had either missed or decided wasn't worth pursuing. She had 1 suitcase, a bleeding lip, and a skull that still rang faintly when she moved too fast. She had a brother, Nikolai. 33, an artist, lived in a walk-up in the Crossroads district and thought Damien was trouble from the first dinner he'd ever attended. She should call Nikolai. That was the rational next step. Nikolai would come, would make bad coffee and worse jokes, would sit with her until the worst of it passed. She picked up her phone. She didn't call. She didn't know why exactly. Later, she would think it was some instinct she couldn't name, some low-frequency warning that the story wasn't finished, that something was still moving in the dark. She would think, in hindsight, that she'd been right, that the thing already in motion was moving toward Nikolai, not her, and that if she'd called him that night, she might have changed nothing, but she would at least have heard his voice one more time. She put the phone face down on the desk. She watched the rain. 3 days later, Seraphina left Blackwater City. She didn't tell anyone. She emptied the checking account at an ATM, took a bus to the edge of the Eastgate district, and found a man who sold things from the back of a dry cleaning shop. Not a criminal exactly, more of a facilitator. And she traded her grandmother's watch, The one thing she hadn't thought to take when the penthouse was stripped, for a bus ticket west and 2 sets of false papers that were good enough for secondary cities. The bus went through 12 states. She got off in a town called Arroyo Seco, population 4,000, somewhere in a flat western expanse where the sky was enormous and the buildings were small and nobody knew what Blackwater City was. She found a motel on the edge of town. She found work washing dishes at a diner 2 blocks from the highway. She did not tell anyone her name. She got sick in the 2nd week. Not metaphorically. Actually sick. A fever that climbed to 104 that left her shaking in a motel bed with thin blankets and a ceiling fan that wobbled on every rotation, in a room that cost $48 a night and smelled like carpet cleaner and old cigarettes. She had no insurance. She had enough cash for another 10 days, maybe 12, if she was careful. She lay in that bed for 3 days and thought about what she'd done wrong. Not just in the courtroom. Not just in the 4 years of marriage. She thought about the specific moments where she'd handed Damien leverage without recognizing what she was doing. The board seats she'd negotiated under the Valecross trust structure because his lawyers said it was tax advantageous, and she'd been too busy to read the secondary clauses. The savings she'd moved into the family account because he'd said joint assets looked better for a development loan they were applying for. The way she'd stopped talking to Nikolai as often after Damien said, gently, always gently, that her brother seemed to have a problem with their relationship, that maybe some distance would be healthier. Distance. She'd given him distance. She'd isolated herself from the one person who would have caught it. On the 3rd day, the fever broke, and she lay in wet sheets staring at the wobbling fan and felt, for the first time, something shift beneath the grief. Something that wasn't hope, exactly. Something harder than hope. She wasn't sure she wanted to call it anger. Anger was emotion. Emotion was what Damien's lawyers had used against her in the asset hearings. Mrs. Cross appeared agitated, Your Honor, as she has throughout these proceedings. And she'd spent 4 years watching Damien use her emotional responses as evidence that she was unstable, impulsive, untrustworthy. She was done giving anyone that weapon. What she felt was more like geometry. Like she was lying in that narrow bed with her fever broken and her defenses stripped entirely, and she was finally able to see the clean architectural lines of how it had all been built. How deliberately. How patiently. Damien hadn't just wanted the divorce. He'd wanted her destroyed. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, and she lay there cataloging it with the precise attention of someone who has decided that understanding is the first form of power. She didn't know then about the judge. She didn't know about the forged evidence. She didn't know about Nikolai. She just knew that something had been done to her on purpose, and that purpose had a structure, and that structures could be studied. She got out of bed. She showered. She went back to the diner and asked for more shifts. It was 6 weeks later that Lucien Moretti came to Arroyo Seco. He didn't come for her. That was important to understand. He came because Arroyo Seco sat along a corridor that 3 different cartel operations used for eastbound transport, and Lucien had a financial interest in what moved through that corridor, and there had been an incident involving a shipment and a federal informant and a body that needed to be accounted for before it became a jurisdictional problem. He came with 2 men and a car, and the specific, focused efficiency of someone who was very good at solving problems that other people couldn't admit existed. Seraphina met him at the diner. She was working the counter that night. They were short-staffed, and she'd picked up the shift because $48 a night meant she couldn't afford to be principled about hours. It was just past midnight. The diner was mostly empty. 2 truckers at the far end of the counter, a young couple sharing a piece of pie near the window. Lucien sat at the counter. He ordered black coffee and said nothing else. He was not what she'd expected, though she'd had no specific expectation, because she hadn't known anything about him yet. He looked like someone who had learned stillness from necessity rather than temperament. Late 30s, dark eyes set in a face that had absorbed some weather. He dressed quietly. Dark jacket, nothing that drew attention. He looked like a contractor or a civil engineer, something practical and functional. He looked like a man who solved problems. He looked, she thought with a specific interior wince, like someone who would read the fine print. She poured his coffee. He looked at her lip. The bruise from Connor's shove had faded to a yellowish shadow 2 weeks ago, but she'd caught sun badly last week, and the discoloration was still faintly visible. "What happened to your face?" he said. Not a question, more like a notation. "Counter," she said. "Caught it on a cabinet." He looked at her for another moment in the way that people who are professionally skeptical look at things. Not unkind, just accurate. "All right," he said, and picked up his coffee. She refilled the trucker's cups. She wiped down the counter. She came back to top off his coffee, and he said, without preamble, "You were in Blackwater City." She went still. Just for half a second, but he caught it the way he caught everything, with that flat, undemonstrative attention. "I don't know what you mean," she said. "You have a tell," he said. "Your shoulders. They go back when you're afraid." She made herself breathe. She made herself meet his eyes. "People move," she said. "Cities don't have exclusive claim on their citizens." "No," he said. "They don't." He turned his coffee cup a quarter turn. "I was in Blackwater 3 months ago, for business. The Vale Cross divorce was visible. Media covered it. A lot of divorces get covered. Not like that one." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not here to make your life harder. You don't know anything about my life." "No," he agreed. "I don't." He left a folded bill on the counter, double the check, and stood up. He took a card from his jacket and set it on top of the bill. Plain card, embossed, just a phone number. "I'm in town 3 days. If you want to talk to someone who won't pretend what was done to you is legal, find me." He walked out. Seraphina stood at the counter for a long moment. Then she picked up the card. She didn't call that night. She went back to her motel and sat on the edge of the bed and held the card and thought about what trusting a stranger had cost her the last time, and whether the ledger on that was closed or still adding up. She thought about geometry. She thought about structures and leverage and the cold architectural truth that what had been built against her was still standing, and she had nothing. Not a law firm, not a financial stake, not a name that meant anything outside a tabloid. Nothing to use against it. She called at noon the next day. He answered on the second ring. They met at a roadside place outside town that afternoon. Metal chairs, bad lighting, 2 styrofoam cups of coffee neither of them drank. Lucien listened to her for 40 minutes without interrupting. She told him about the trust structure and the forged filings, and the judge's demeanor and Connor's shove, and the photograph that had run under a caption that made her sound like a cautionary tale. She told him because he had the face of someone who would receive information without reacting to it, and she was tired of people reacting to her with pity or satisfaction, and she needed to say it to someone who would just hear it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The trust structure," he said. "Who built it?" "Damien's attorneys." "Garrison?" She looked at him. "You know Garrison." "I know what Garrison does," he said. "He's built similar structures for 3 other clients in the last 8 years, all of them designed to transfer assets in anticipation of litigation." He said it evenly, like a man reading a spreadsheet. "It's not legal, it's documentable. And Garrison knows that if his client list starts talking to the right people, he has more exposure than the clients do." "Who are the right people?" Lucien looked at her steadily. "That depends on what you want." "I want—" She stopped. She made herself think before she answered, which was not something she'd always done. She thought about what she'd said to herself in the motel, about structures, about leverage. "I want to understand how it worked. All of it. I want to see the whole architecture." He nodded once, as if that was the right answer. "That I can help you with." She looked at him across the styrofoam cups and the bad lighting and thought, "I don't know who you are. I don't know what you want. I don't know if this is another room I'll regret walking into." She thought, "I'm 31 years old, and I have $1,700 and a motel that smells like carpet cleaner." She thought, "I have been careful and polite and trusting and patient, and I have nothing." She thought, "All right. Tell me how it works," she said. "Tell me how power actually works." Lucien Moretti settled back in his chair. Outside the window, the flat western sky burned orange with late afternoon light, enormous and indifferent. "It starts with information," he said. "Everything else is derivative." Seraphina picked up the styrofoam cup. The coffee was cold. She drank it anyway. That was 5 years ago. Now she stands at the threshold of the Astronova Hotel's obsidian ballroom in a black silk gown, a diamond serpent coiled at her throat, and every person in this room who knew her when she was bleeding on marble courthouse floors has just registered that she's here, and alive, and not alone. The music stops. Not because anyone gave an order, because humans are animals before they're socialites, and animals respond to threat even when they're standing in $3,000 shoes holding champagne flutes, and every animal in this room just felt the air change. Lucien is at her left shoulder, half a step back, not behind her, not protective adjacent, but positioned the way men position themselves when they are absolutely certain that nothing in the room can touch them, and they want everyone to know it. He wears a dark suit, no pocket square, nothing decorative. He doesn't need to be decorative. He is the most powerful man in this room and the most dangerous, and every person who matters already knows it. Seraphina doesn't look at the crowd. She doesn't need to scan for reactions. She can feel them. The dropped conversations, the turned heads, the specific electric charge of recognition rippling outward from the gold doors like a stone dropped in still water. She looks at Damien. He's standing near the far end of the ballroom beside a cluster of city council members and a man she recognizes as a federal lobbying consultant. He's wearing charcoal, which means he's taking this event seriously. He has a glass of something amber in his right hand, and he has not yet turned toward the doors because he was mid-sentence when the music stopped. And the mid-sentence expression is still on his face. Animated, confident, the expression of a man who has never once worried that the past might walk back in through the front door. Then someone touches his elbow. He turns, and Seraphina watches, from 40 feet away, the color leave his face. Not gradually, not in stages. It goes like a light switch. One moment the warm, confident flush of a man at the top of his controlled world, and then nothing. White. The specific pallor of someone whose body has registered catastrophic information before their conscious mind has finished processing it. His glass tilts. Amber liquid moves toward the rim. His hand compensates automatically. His eyes don't move from her. Seraphina holds his gaze for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turns away. Not dismissive, not theatrical, just a woman scanning a room she's decided to own, and accepts a champagne flute from a passing server and says something quiet to Lucien that makes him almost smile. And in the 3 seconds before the music restarts, in the held breath silence of 400 people recalibrating everything they thought they knew about Seraphina Vale, Damien Cross sets his glass on a nearby tray with a hand that is not entirely steady, and reaches for his phone. Damien's phone call lasted 4 minutes. Seraphina knew because she was counting. Not obviously. She was standing near the east wall of the ballroom with a champagne flute she hadn't touched, talking to a woman named Celeste Okafor, who ran the city's largest architectural firm and who had, to her credit, greeted Seraphina's return with nothing more dramatic than a raised eyebrow and a dry, "Well, that's an entrance." But while Celeste talked about the new waterfront development and the zoning fights with the Third Ward, Seraphina's peripheral vision tracked the far side of the room with the patience of someone who had spent 5 years learning to watch, without appearing to watch. Damien had moved to a service corridor off the main hall. His back was to the room. His shoulders were up around his ears. 4 minutes, and then he came back out. The color had returned to his face. Not naturally, but effortfully, the way a man puts on a coat in cold weather. He'd reconstructed the expression, reassembled the jaw, convinced his hands to stop doing whatever they'd been doing. He crossed the ballroom floor and rejoined the cluster of city council members and said something that made 2 of them laugh. He didn't look at her again. That was more concerning than if he had. "You've gone somewhere," Celeste said. Seraphina refocused. "Sorry, long week." "I imagine." Celeste tilted her glass. "You know half the room is going to pretend they always supported you, and the other half is going to pretend you don't exist. Which half are you?" "I'm the third half that's just glad the evening got interesting." Celeste's eyes moved briefly to Lucien, who was 20 feet away in conversation with a man Seraphina recognized as the deputy director of the city's port authority. "Is he as dangerous as they say?" "More," Seraphina said. Celeste smiled with the corner of her mouth. "Good." Lucien extracted himself from the Port Authority conversation with the practiced ease of a man who ended things on his own schedule and crossed to Seraphina's side. He nodded once at Celeste, not warm, not cold, the nod of a man who has assessed someone and found them non-threatening and is moving on, and then said to Seraphina quietly, "Cross made a call. I had it flagged." He reached a number registered to a shell company in the Meridian Tower portfolio. Garrison? Garrison's people. Maybe Garrison himself. He accepted a water glass from a passing server and didn't drink it. He's not panicking, he's activating. I know. She watched Damien across the room laughing at something. He rebuilt fast after I noticed. 6 seconds, and he had his face back. That's a practiced reflex. Yes. She finally drank some of the champagne. It was very good champagne, and she registered that somewhere distant, the way you register weather you're not standing in. He was expecting something like this. Not us specifically, but some form of retaliation. He's had contingency architecture in place. Everyone does, Lucian said. The question is whether the contingency accounts for the specific threat. It doesn't. You're certain? She looked at him sideways. I built his financial reporting systems, Lucian. I designed the data architecture for Cross Holdings' first 3 acquisition cycles. Whatever he's protecting, I know where the doors are. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Then we proceed as planned. We proceed as planned. The gala moved around them, waiters with silver trays, the low swell of a string quartet resuming from a corner, the ambient machinery of wealth performing itself. Seraphina moved through it with Lucien a half-step behind, and she watched people decide how to react to her in real time. Some came forward, the ones who'd always been transactional, who understood that she was now attached to something more powerful than Damien's name, and adjusted accordingly. Some retreated, the ones who'd been at Damien's table for years, who recognized that their loyalties were now visible and legible and potentially costly. A few, a very few, looked at her with something that might have been genuine relief, the way people look when someone they'd written off turns out to still be breathing. She gave everyone the same face, composed, attentive, slightly amused. It was the most expensive thing she owned. The moment that changed the evening's temperature came 40 minutes in. She was near the bar when Connor Cross appeared. He was drunker than his brother, which was typical, and less controlled, which was also typical. He came from the direction of the private reception rooms in the East Wing, straightening his jacket with the slightly aggressive over-precision of someone who'd had 4 drinks and was trying to pass for 2. He saw her before she had an ideal angle on the situation, before Lucien was in her immediate proximity. And something moved across his face that was uglier than surprise. Seraphina. He said her name the way you'd say a slur, not loudly, but with a specific loading of contempt. She turned to face him fully. Connor. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to be intimate, which was deliberate. He'd always used proximity as a dominant signal. He'd done it in the courthouse corridor. He'd done it at a Christmas party 4 years ago when she'd caught him going through her phone. He'd done it every time he wanted to remind her that the men in this family took up space and she was permitted to exist within whatever margin they defined. You got some nerve, he said. I've been told. Showing up here. Tonight. He looked past her, locating Lucien, and something shifted in his face. Not fear exactly, more like a recalibration. Then he looked back at her. What is this? What are you trying to do? I was invited, she said. Celeste Okafor sent the invitation personally. I assume she sends them to everyone on the donor list, and I'm on the donor list. You don't have money. I don't have the money your brother took from me, she said. Those aren't the same thing. His jaw worked. He was trying to process several things at once. Her tone, which was wrong. It was too level. It was the tone of someone who knew they had the stronger hand, and Lucien's presence somewhere in his peripheral vision, and the fact that they were standing in the middle of a room full of people with phones and long memories. Damien's going to destroy you, he said. Low now. Almost conversational. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever this is, you came back to a city where he owns every room. He owns this room? He owns the people in it. Some of them, she said. Not as many as he thinks. She looked at Connor the way you look at something you're deciding whether to step over or around. You shoved me into a wall 4 years ago, Connor, in front of cameras, in front of witnesses. The footage exists. I have it. I have 3 other incidents on record from before the marriage and 2 from during it, all documented, all with corroborating witnesses who are currently willing to provide sworn statements. She watched his face go through its changes. I'm not telling you this as a threat. I'm telling you so that you understand the landscape. This isn't the same terrain it was 5 years ago. Connor stared at her. Something moved behind his eyes that she'd never seen there before in all the years of knowing him. He'd always been blunt and crude and certain of his own invulnerability in the way that younger brothers of powerful men often are. What she saw now was something closer to fear, not of her precisely, but of a situation he suddenly couldn't read. He left without saying anything else. Seraphina turned back to the bar and requested a water with lemon. Her pulse was slightly elevated. Not much. She was aware of it the way a pilot is aware of turbulence, noting it, filing it, not alarmed. Lucien appeared at her elbow. That was visible. It was meant to be. I said we'd move carefully. I was careful. I told him nothing he couldn't know from public records. She turned the water glass. And now Damien knows Connor came at me and it didn't work, which communicates something about the new balance that Damien needs to understand early. Lucien looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd learned to read over 5 years. Not disapproval, exactly, more like the face of a man recalculating. He had taught her to think 3 moves ahead. He was occasionally surprised when she did. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. They left the gala at 11. Not early, not late. Exactly when they'd planned to leave, which was itself a communication. You didn't flee, and you didn't linger. You departed on your own timeline, and you let the room watch you do it. The car was waiting on the south side of the hotel. Black, unmarkable, driven by a man named Theo, who had worked for Lucien for 11 years, and who Seraphina trusted more than anyone except Lucien himself, which was a short list by design. She slid into the back seat and felt the city's noise muffle as the door closed, and for a moment she allowed herself to feel the weight of the evening settling into her joints. The hours of held composure, the controlled breathing, the continuous low-grade calculation. "The federal contact," she said, as Theo pulled into traffic. "Reyes, he's ready?" "He's been ready for 2 weeks." Lucien was looking at his phone. "The garrison filings are packaged. Anonymous submission goes through a secured channel to the Financial Crimes Division. Once it lands, they have no choice but to open a preliminary investigation. Timeline. If it goes in tonight, they have a file by Friday. Formal investigation launch, 6 to 8 weeks depending on caseload and who picks it up internally. Damien will know within 48 hours that something's moving. He'll suspect. He won't know what or from where. Seraphina watched the city slide past the window. Blackwater at night still had a specific quality that she'd missed in the flat western spaces. The way the neon bled into wet pavement, the compressed verticality of it, the sense that everything was happening simultaneously in stacked layers above and below street level. She'd hated it after leaving. Then she'd missed it. Then she'd understood that missing it was information about who she actually was, rather than who she'd tried to become. "His warehouses," she said. "Eastport and the Garment District facility, both under federal surveillance as of last month. That was Reyes's team. And the executives, Harmon and Cole specifically." Lucien set his phone down. "What about them?" "Harmon has been trying to transfer his personal holdings out of the country for 3 months. He's been using a financial services firm in the Cayman circuit that I know is already on Treasury's watch list. He doesn't know that." She turned from the window. "If he finds out that an investigation is opening, he'll run. If he runs, he becomes a cooperating witness before Damien's attorneys can contain him. You want him scared before the investigation is public. I want him to hear something that makes him feel like the walls are already closing, not from us, from someone he trusts." She paused. "Does he trust anyone?" Lucien looked at her with something that might have been appreciation in the specific way he showed appreciation, a slight, barely there adjustment around the eyes, a fractional relaxation of the jaw. "His golf partner," he said, "works in the acquisitions division at a rival firm, owes me a favor from 2 years ago. Can the favor be called in without the connection being visible?" It can be arranged as a social conversation. Concerned colleague, heard some troubling things. Then arrange it. She turned back to the window. Harmon in federal hands is worth more than the warehouse raids. He knows where Damien hid the political payments. Lucian was quiet for a moment. Outside, the city moved past. Theo navigated through the Meridian district without being directed to ditch. He knew where they were going. You've been planning Harmon specifically for a while, Lucian said. 3 months. You didn't mention it. I wanted to be certain the pathway was clean before I brought it to the table. Another pause. Longer this time. Seraphina, I know what you're going to say. We agreed on transparency inside the operation. No parallel tracks. It isn't a parallel track. It's the same track. I just didn't table it until I was confident. That's the distinction I'm raising. His voice was even. It was always even, which was how you knew when it mattered. You made a unilateral decision about what to share and when. She was quiet. She looked at her hands in her lap. She was wearing black gloves. It had been a cold evening, and she pulled them off now, finger by finger, and felt the cool air of the car against her palms. You're right, she said. He didn't say I know or thank you or any of the things other people said when they won an argument. He just nodded once and picked up his phone again. She folded the gloves and held them. She thought about the difference between caution and control and whether she'd crossed a line she hadn't been willing to look at directly. In the years she'd spent inside Lucien's operation, learning the logic of it, the hierarchy of information, the precise language of leverage and consequence, she'd come to understand that the rules he operated by weren't arbitrary. They were functional. They existed because the alternative was chaos, and chaos got people killed. She also knew, and had known for some time without fully acknowledging it, that she had developed a private layer of planning that ran slightly below the main operation. Not against it, never against it, but adjacent. A track she kept for herself because 5 years ago she had trusted completely and it had cost her everything, and some part of her had decided at a cellular level that she would never again put every piece of herself into someone else's hands, even Lucien's. That was its own problem, and she knew it, and she put it away for later. The car stopped at the Meridian Townhouse, their base of operations in the city, a narrow 4-story building that looked from the outside like an architectural firm and functioned on the inside as something considerably more complex. Theo held the door. Seraphina stepped out into the cool night air and stood for a moment on the sidewalk, feeling the city vibrate at its low continuous frequency beneath her feet. The message arrived on her secure phone at 12:43 a.m. She was in the operations room on the 3rd floor, a space that looked nothing like what film taught people to expect from criminal enterprises. No maps pinned to walls, no corkboards with red string, just 3 clean workstations and a wall of monitors showing feeds from various positions around the city. The message came through the encrypted channel she used for the contacts she'd cultivated inside the Blackwater City records office. A woman named Adela, who processed corporate filing requests and had, over 17 months of careful relationship building, become willing to flag certain document requests for a monthly fee that Seraphina paid in cash through 3 intermediaries. The message said, Cross Holdings legal team requested full retrieval of archived trust documents, Vale Cross family filing, date range 2017 to 2021. Request logged 11:58 p.m. tonight. Physical retrieval scheduled 8 a.m. tomorrow. Seraphina read it twice. Then she took it to Lucian. He read it once. He's moving to destroy the originals. Or have them altered. Garrison's team has done it before. The documents that come back from retrieval aren't always identical to the ones that go in. She sat down across from him at the main desk. The monitors threw blue light across both their faces. If he successfully alters the trust documents before the federal investigation opens the file, we lose the cleanest evidentiary thread we have. What's the timeline? 8 a.m. retrieval. If we want to intercept, we have 7 hours. Lucian looked at his watch, then at her. I have a contact in the records office building, maintenance level. He can access the filing storage, but it takes time to locate specific archived documents. Adela can direct him to the exact shelf location. I can have that in 20 minutes. And once we have them, we copy them. We return the originals to exactly where they were, and we submit the copies through the Reyes channel tonight, ahead of schedule." She watched him think. If Garrison's team retrieves documents tomorrow morning and finds they've already been forwarded to a federal investigation, they have two choices: alter documents that are now on federal record, which is a separate felony, or walk away and leave the originals intact. Either way, we've moved the timeline up by about 6 weeks. Lucien was quiet for 4 seconds. She'd learned to count his silences because they had different qualities at different lengths. 2 seconds was processing, 4 seconds was weighing risk. Anything past 6 was a conversation. "Do it," he said. "But Seraphina, I know. I mean it. Nothing improvised. Theo drives, Mark handles the building access, you stay in the car and manage communications. That's the boundary." "I understand." She didn't fully mean it when she said it. She understood the boundary. She intended to respect it. She told herself both those things were the same. They weren't. The operation ran cleanly for the first 2 hours. Theo took a route that avoided the main surveillance corridors around City Hall. Marek, a man of about 50 with large hands and the unhurried movements of someone who'd done delicate work for a long time, entered the records office building through a service entrance using credentials Lucien's contact had provided. The building was minimally staffed overnight: 2 security guards, a rotating patrol, 1 maintenance worker who was also Lucien's contact and who had agreed to disable the relevant camera loop for a 40-minute window in exchange for a figure that represented 6 months of his salary. Seraphina sat in the back of the car with her secure phone and coordinated. Adela's location data guided Marek to the correct archive shelf on the 4th floor. The files were there, physically present, undisturbed. Marek photographed every page: 43 pages of trust documentation, board filing records, and a series of internal memos that Seraphina recognized from the original construction of the Vale Cross Trust, and which contained, in the dry language of corporate legal correspondence, enough evidence of premeditated asset manipulation to make Garrison's career disappear. Marek sent the files through a compressed encrypted transfer. Seraphina verified each page. She was going through page 31, a memo from one of Garrison's associates discussing the timeline for freezing the joint accounts, when she stopped. She read the memo again. Then she read it a 3rd time, because the first 2 times she'd thought she was misreading it. She wasn't. The memo was dated 14 months before the divorce filing. That wasn't the part that stopped her breathing. The part that stopped her breathing was the subject line and the final paragraph, and the name that appeared in both. The subject line read, "Contingency, N, Vale, Crossroads District." The final paragraph read, "As discussed, the timeline for the Crossroads matter should be coordinated with the asset transfer sequence to ensure no independent legal recourse remains available to the respondent. The consultant has confirmed the service can be rendered within the divorce proceedings window. See attached for the revised coordination schedule. N, Vale, Nikolai Vale y Vale, her brother, the Crossroads District, where he'd lived in his walk-up apartment. The service can be rendered." Seraphina sat in the back of the car and her hand stopped working and the phone nearly went to the floor. She caught it. She read the paragraph again. The service can be rendered within the divorce proceedings window. She thought about calling Nikolai after the courthouse and deciding not to. She thought about the specific weight of that decision and what she'd told herself at the time, that some instinct had warned her, that something was already moving in the dark. She thought about how she'd never been able to reach him afterward. She'd tried from the road, from the bus, once from a payphone in a gas station outside of Arroyo Seco. The number had gone to a message that said the line was no longer in service. She told herself he'd changed his number, that maybe he was angry at her for leaving, that she'd reach out properly once she was stable and safe. She'd never let herself look too directly at the other possibility. She looked at it now. "Theo," she said. Her voice came out level and she was distantly impressed by that, the way she'd been impressed, that she walked out of the courthouse upright. "I need you to pull over. We're 4 blocks from—" "Pull over." He pulled over. She got out of the car. The night air was cold and she was standing on a sidewalk in the financial district at 3 in the morning in a dress that cost $4,000, and she was breathing very carefully, The way you breathe when your body wants to do something violent, and you're telling it not to yet. She called Lucien. He answered on the first ring. Report. We have the documents. Marek is finishing the return sequence. She paused. There's a memo. Page 31. Subject line references my brother. Silence. Lucien. I see it. He'd accessed the transfer file. His voice didn't change, which was how she knew he understood exactly what she was looking at. Seraphina. Tell me what happened to Nikolai. A pause that lasted exactly 6 seconds. I didn't know, he said, when I found you in Arroyo Seco. I want you to be clear on that. By the time I understood the full scope of what Cross had done, you and I were already... He stopped. I made a decision about timing, about what you needed to be focused on and when. You knew. The words came out very quiet. You knew and you didn't tell me. I knew 3 years ago. I was building toward a moment where the information would serve you instead of, he's dead. It wasn't a question. Nikolai is dead. The 6-second silence was the answer. She stood on the sidewalk and the city made its noise around her, and she felt something happening in her chest that she recognized as the specific point where calculation ends and something older begins, something that doesn't speak in strategy or leverage or geometric patience. She felt it arriving the way you feel a storm arriving, the pressure change before the first drop. She got back in the car. Change of plan, she said to Theo. The operations director said, I know what he said. She pulled up a contact on her phone, a name she'd stored 18 months ago and never used, a man who operated in the space between Lucien's network and the city's criminal underbelly, who had access to assets and locations that Lucien's more structured operation didn't reach. Drive to the Eastgate district, the Callaway building. Theo didn't move the car. I can't authorize a deviation without... Theo. She looked at him in the rearview mirror. Drive the car. He drove the car. And somewhere behind them, on the 3rd floor of the Meridian townhouse, Lucien Moretti looked at his phone and at the memo on his screen and at the location signal from Seraphina's phone already moving east, away from the planned route. And he sat very still for a long moment, long enough that the expression on his face, had anyone been there to see it, was the closest thing to fear that face was capable of producing. Then he stood up and reached for his jacket. The Callaway building had been abandoned for 11 years. It sat at the eastern edge of the Eastgate district like a tooth that hadn't been pulled yet. 8 stories of reinforced concrete and broken windows, surrounded by a chain-link fence that had been cut and repatched so many times the repairs were indistinguishable from the original structure. The city had issued 3 demolition orders in the past decade. Each one had been quietly tabled by a council member whose campaign contributions traced back through 2 shell companies to Cross Holdings LLC. Seraphina knew this because she'd mapped it. 3 months ago, when she was building the evidentiary architecture for the federal submission, she'd traced every property in Blackwater City that Damien held through intermediaries, not for operational use, just to understand the full geometry of what he owned. The Callaway building had appeared as a footnote, a property held dormant, officially condemned, generating no revenue and requiring no maintenance filings. She'd noted it and moved on. She understood now why it generated no revenue. Theo stopped the car a block east of the fence line. Seraphina was already out before the engine cut. You need to wait for... Theo started. 90 minutes, she said. If I'm not back, call Lucien. Don't call him before. He's already... 90 minutes, Theo. She walked toward the building without looking back. The night was cold and clear, and the Eastgate district at 4 in the morning was the kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, the quiet of a place where noise has learned to be careful. Somewhere east of her, a dog was barking at something persistent and invisible. A sodium lamp 2 blocks north threw orange light across wet pavement, and nothing else. The contact's name was Dario Resch. She'd acquired him the same way she'd acquired most useful things in the last 5 years. Not through Lucien's network, but adjacent to it, in the spaces where Lucien's structured operation didn't reach, because it didn't need to. Dario operated in the city's subterranean economy, not a criminal in any organized sense, more of a broker for the kind of information that existed below the level where organizations kept records. He knew where things happened that weren't supposed to have happened. He knew where people went when they needed to be somewhere that didn't exist. She'd spent 18 months cultivating him with the patience of someone who had learned patience from a man who understood it as a weapon. She'd never called in the relationship. She was calling it in now. He was waiting inside the building's ground floor, in a space that had once been a loading dock and was now a collection of salvaged furniture and extension cords running from a generator that hummed with the low persistence of a headache. He was smaller than she remembered from their 2 previous in-person meetings, mid-40s, compact, with the slightly compressed posture of a man who'd spent years in small spaces. He had a thermos of coffee and the expression of someone who hadn't been surprised to receive her call at 3:15 in the morning, but wasn't pleased about it either. "You look like you've had a night," he said. "I need everything you have on a man named Nikolai Vale." She sat down across from him without being invited to. Crossroads District, artist, disappeared approximately 5 years ago. Dario poured from the thermos into a second cup she hadn't noticed and pushed it across the crate between them. "Disappeared how? That's what I need you to tell me." He looked at her for a moment with the assessing quiet of someone who dealt in information and understood that how a person asked for something told you as much as what they were asking for. Whatever he saw in her face, he didn't comment on it directly. He picked up his own cup. "Nikolai Vale," he said. "Painter. Did some installation work, commercial commissions, had a show at the Bridger Gallery about 6 years back that got a decent write-up in the arts section." He paused. "You're his sister?" "Yes." "You were married to Damien Cross?" "Yes." He turned the cup in his hands. "I know about Nikolai Vale," he said. "I've known for 4 years. I didn't know you were his sister until about 30 seconds ago." The generator hummed. Somewhere above them, a pipe dripped with metronomic regularity. "Tell me," she said. Dario set his cup down. He looked at the table between them, rather than at her, which she recognized as the face of a man about to deliver information he'd rather not be responsible for delivering. It was handled by a man named Creel, Delbert Creel, works private security and selected other services for a client list that overlapped significantly with the Meridian Tower professional community. Garrison's firm uses him for sensitive matters. Cross Holdings has used him at least twice that I know of. He paused. Creel's not a shooter. He subcontracts. The actual work was done by a man who's since left the country. "The work," she said. Her voice was flat. "Nikolai Vale died on the 14th of March, 5 years ago, 11 days after your divorce was finalized." Dario finally looked up at her. It was staged as a robbery. The Crossroads District had a string of them that year. 3 businesses, 2 residential, one of which involved a fatality. Nikolai's incident was inserted into that pattern, same MO, same general time frame, clean attribution to a street-level crime wave that the department was already managing. He paused. The department closed all 6 cases as related incidents. It was never investigated as anything else. Seraphina sat very still. She was aware of specific physical details with extreme clarity, the texture of the salvaged chair beneath her, the smell of the generator exhaust mixing with old concrete and damp, the precise weight of the cup in her hand which she had not drunk from and did not put down. She was aware of the quality of the silence inside her own body, which was different from ordinary silence, which had a kind of pressure to it, like the silence at the bottom of something very deep. "Garrison's firm commissioned it," she said. Creel was paid through a vendor account registered to a consulting company that Garrison's firm uses for what they call conflict resolution services. Dario's voice was careful. "The payment was made 8 days before your divorce finalized. The timing was—" He stopped. "It was preemptive," she said. "They killed him before the divorce was final so that if I contested anything afterward, I had no one, no family with resources, no one who might independently investigate or fund a countersuit." She heard herself say it, and the logic of it was so clean, so coldly functional, that it was almost worse than if it had been merely cruel. It had been strategic. Her brother had been a strategic loose end. "They killed him because he would have fought for me." Dario didn't say anything. "He would have mortgaged everything he had," she said. Her voice was still level. It occurred to her, at a great distance, that she should probably not be this calm, that this specific quality of calm was not actually calm, but something that had moved beyond the register that calm, and not calm, could describe. He would have gone to every attorney in the city. He would have made noise until someone listened. Probably, Dario said quietly. So they removed him. She put the cup down on the crate. She put both hands flat on the surface and felt the rough wood grain against her palms, and she focused on that, the physical fact of it, the specific texture, because she needed something external and real to orient against while the interior landscape reorganized itself around what she now knew. She'd been working on this operation for 2 years. She'd been working on it with the patience and the geometry she'd built from nothing in a flat western town after a fever broke and showed her the architecture of her own destruction. She'd built it correctly. She'd built it carefully. She'd built it with Lucian's methodology and her own intelligence and a discipline she was genuinely proud of, the kind of pride that doesn't announce itself because it's been earned in private. She'd built it as an operation for justice, for herself, for what had been done to her. She had not known what had been done to Nikolai, and now she did. And the operation she'd built suddenly felt like a different thing. Not wrong, not misdirected, but insufficient. Like she'd been building a response to a crime that was smaller than the actual crime. Like she'd been answering a question that was the wrong question. She stood up. "I need Creel's current location," she said. Dario's face changed. "Seraphina, don't!" She looked at him directly. "I'm not asking you to make a decision about what I do with it. I'm asking you for information. That's the transaction." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and produced a folded piece of paper and set it on the crate. "He keeps an office in the textile building on Wander Street, 3rd floor, east side. He's there Tuesday through Thursday, typically." A pause. "It's Tuesday." She took the paper. She was back in the car by 4:47. Theo looked at her in the rearview mirror, and whatever he saw made him not say anything, which was the right decision. She told him the textile building on Wander Street, and he drove without questioning it, and she sat in the back seat with the folded paper in her hands and felt the city slide past and thought about Nikolai. He'd been 33 when he died. He'd had a show at the Bridger Gallery and a walk-up apartment and a coffee maker he'd owned since college that he'd carried through 4 moves because he said it made better coffee than any replacement. He'd told her at a birthday dinner 2 years before the divorce, her birthday, he'd cooked. It had been the last time she'd been in his apartment. That he thought Damien watched her the way someone watches something they're afraid of losing, which he said was not the same as loving it. She'd told him he was wrong. She'd believed it when she said it. She'd chosen Damien's version of events over Nikolai's read of the situation. She'd accepted the distance Damien had suggested. She'd let it accumulate until 11 days after a judge stripped her of everything. Her brother was inserted into a pattern of street crime and closed as a statistic. She would not be able to fix that. She understood that with the cold clarity of someone who has stopped lying to themselves about what can and cannot be undone. She could not fix Nikolai. She could not retroactively choose differently. She could not give him back the show at the Bridger Gallery, or the bad coffee maker, or the 30-odd years he hadn't gotten to finish living. What she could do was make sure the people who had decided his life was a strategic variable understood, with their bodies, what that decision had cost. The textile building on Wander Street was a 6-story commercial property in the Mid-Eastgate district that had been converted from manufacturing to office use in the 90s. At 5 in the morning, it was nearly empty. A cleaning crew on the lower floors, a night shift data processing operation on the 2nd floor that she could see through the windows. The 3rd floor was dark, except for one window on the east side, where a desk lamp threw a circle of yellow light against the glass. "Wait here," she told Theo. "Seraphina, I cannot—" She got out of the car. This was the mistake. She knew it was the mistake, even as she was making it. She'd been told, by Lucienne, by her own accumulated understanding of how operations went wrong, that the most dangerous moment in any action was the moment when emotion outran planning, when the personal weight of a situation pulled you off the track you'd built and onto improvised ground where you had no preparation and no backup and no margin for the variables you hadn't anticipated. She knew all of that. She went into the building anyway. The lobby was unmanned at this hour. She took the stairs. 3rd floor, east side. She found the office at the end of a narrow corridor with industrial carpeting and buzzing fluorescent lights, one of which was failing in the specific intermittent way that makes the quality of light feel unstable. The door had a frosted glass panel. The desk lamp behind it threw the shadow of a seated figure. She opened the door. Delbert Creel was a man of about 55, with the broad, slightly softened build of someone who'd been physically capable 20 years ago and had been living on that reputation since. He had reading glasses on and a file open on the desk and a ceramic mug that said something she didn't read. He looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who was surprised but not alarmed, which meant he hadn't yet registered what her presence in his office at 5 in the morning was likely to mean. Then he registered it. He started to reach for the desk drawer. "Don't," she said. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She said it in the voice that Lucien had once told her was her most effective instrument. Not loud, not theatrical, simply carrying the absolute conviction that she meant exactly what she said and would follow it to whatever conclusion it required. Creel's hand stopped. She closed the door behind her and crossed to the desk and stood over him. He was larger than her by 60 pounds and 8 inches, and the only reason the physical equation was working in her favor right now was that he didn't know what she knew and didn't know what she had, and uncertainty is its own leverage. "Nikolai Vale," she said. "Crossroads District, March, 5 years ago." Creel's face went through several changes in rapid sequence. Surprise, recalculation, a brief assessment of the room, and then a settling into something like resigned wariness. He took his glasses off and set them on the file folder. "I don't know what the vendor account payment," she said. "The consulting company, Garrison's firm." She watched his face. "The financial records are already in federal hands. I'm not here to collect evidence. I'm here because I want to look at you." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You're the sister?" "Yes." He looked at her for a long time. Whatever moral architecture Delbert Creel operated inside, she couldn't read it. He had the face of someone who'd made a professional practice of not having a face. Smooth, reserved, giving nothing away involuntarily. "What do you want?" he said. "I want you to understand something." She leaned forward and put both hands on the desk and looked at him from 18 inches. "I want you to understand that what you did and what Creel and Garrison and Damian Cross did not achieve what it was designed to achieve. My brother was supposed to be the thing that broke me. He was supposed to be the variable that made me give up or fall apart or disappear quietly." She held his gaze. "I'm still here. I'm standing in your office at 5 in the morning, and the people who paid you have a federal investigation opening on Friday, and every document that connects you to Garrison's consulting account is already on a server that I don't control and cannot be touched." She straightened. "I want you to spend the rest of your life knowing that it didn't work." She turned to leave. She was 2 steps from the door when she heard the drawer. She turned. Creel had the gun out, a compact, dark, service-weight automatic that he held with the practiced ease of someone who'd been doing it since before she was born. He wasn't pointing it at her. He was holding it on the desk with his hand resting on it, the barrel oriented between them, a posture that said, "I'm not shooting you, and don't test that simultaneously." "Sit down," he said. She didn't sit. "You shoot me in your office at 5 in the morning, and whatever narrative Damien has been building becomes a crime scene." "Sit down," he said again, the same tone, patient. She sat down. Creel picked up his phone with his left hand, keeping the right on the weapon, and dialed a number. He held it to his ear and watched her while it connected. She heard it ring twice, and then a voice she didn't recognize answered with a single word. "We have a situation," Creel said. "Moretti's woman is in my office." A pause. "Yes." Another pause. Longer. "Understood." He hung up. They sat in silence for 4 minutes. Seraphina watched the gun on the desk and calculated. The drawer it had come from was on the right side. He was right-handed. The angle of his grip confirmed that. The desk between them was standard issue, metal frame, not something she could move. The door was 7 feet behind her. The window to her left was 3rd floor, the wrong kind of wrong. The door opened. 2 men came in. She didn't know them, but she knew the type. The compressed efficiency of people who did physical work of the kind that left no visible evidence. One was younger, close-cropped, with the flat eyes of someone who'd learned not to react to things. The other was older, heavy in the shoulders, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose joints had been in cold weather. Behind them came a 3rd person, Connor Cross. He looked better than he had at the gala, or rather, He looked like he'd had time to reconstruct himself. The bourbon looseness was gone. He was wearing different clothes, and he had the expression of a man who had received a phone call that reorganized his evening into something he hadn't been expecting but was now, with some effort, choosing to see as an opportunity. He looked at Seraphina sitting in the chair with her hands in her lap and the gun on the desk between her and Creel, and he smiled. Not the gala smile, not the public version that was a copy of Damien's warmth, the other smile, the one that was entirely his own. "Well," he said. He pulled a chair from against the wall and turned it around and sat on it backwards, arms crossed over the back. "This is new. Connor, you know what Damien said when I called him just now?" He tilted his head. He said, and I want to get this right, he said, "Bring her in and we'll find out what they actually have." Which is interesting, right? Because it means he thinks you might actually have something. He studied her. "Do you?" "Your brother is going to federal prison," she said. "You can make choices right now that determine whether you're in the cell next to him." Connor laughed. It was a real laugh, which was somehow worse than if it had been performed. "See, that's what you always talk like that, like you were ahead of things, like you had the angle." He shook his head. "You came here alone, in the middle of the night. Nobody knows you're here except the driver sitting outside, who my guy is currently having a conversation with." Seraphina's chest did something involuntary. "Theo's fine," Connor said, reading her face with the accuracy of someone who'd been watching her reactions for 4 years. "He's fine as long as this conversation goes well. It's a contingent situation." He unfolded his arms and leaned forward on the chair back. "Here's what I need to know. The documents you lifted from the records office tonight, copies went where?" She said nothing. "Seraphina." The voice dropped. "Theo is 47 years old and he has a daughter in the West Side School District. I know because Damien had everyone in Moretti's immediate operation researched after the gala tonight." He let that settle. "Where did the copies go?" She looked at him. She thought about the encrypted transfer channel and the federal submission and the server she'd told Creel she couldn't touch, which was true, and the timing, which was the variable she was now doing rapid arithmetic on. The submission had been scheduled for tonight. The record sheet had Marek copy, the Garrison Trust documents, the federal channel through Reyes. If Lucien had pulled the trigger on the submission after she deviated from the route, and knowing Lucien, knowing the specific way he managed operations when elements went off plan, it was possible the submission had already gone through. Possible. Not certain. She had no way to know without her phone, which the younger man had taken when he came through the door with such practiced ease that she'd barely registered it happening. "I want to talk to Damien," she said. "Damien doesn't want to talk to you." "He will when I tell him what I know about the judge." Connor's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, a small, almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. "What about the judge?" "I want to talk to Damien," she said again. Connor stood up. He straightened the chair and pushed it back against the wall with the deliberate calm of a man who had decided on a course of action and was now in the execution phase. He said something in a low voice to the older man. She didn't catch it, and the older man nodded and moved toward her. She stood up before he reached her. "I'll walk." The older man stopped. Connor nodded. She walked out of the office between the two men, Creel following, Connor ahead, into the corridor with its failing fluorescent light and its industrial carpet, and she moved with them toward the stairwell, and she was thinking very fast about very specific things. The layout of the building she'd noted coming in, the cleaning crew on the lower floors, the data processing operation on the second floor, the location of the stairwell relative to the exterior wall and the street. She was thinking about what Lucien would do when Theo's 90-minute window expired. She was thinking about whether the federal submission had gone through. She was thinking about the memo on page 31 and her brother's apartment in the Crossroads district and the coffee maker he'd carried through 4 moves. She was thinking about the loaded calculation Connor had just laid in front of her, that Theo's safety was contingent on her compliance, which meant she was now inside a leverage structure that had been built specifically for her, tailored to the one variable that would override her discipline. She was thinking that Damien Cross had, even now, even after 5 years of her rebuilding herself into something he'd never anticipated, correctly identified the precise shape of her remaining vulnerability. She was thinking that she had broken Lucian's rule, stay in the car, nothing improvised, and that the cost of that was now visible, and it was exactly the cost Lucian would have predicted, and the specific quality of being right about that, of having walked into the exact outcome her best teacher had warned her about, was a kind of interior devastation that she would not allow herself to feel right now because right now she needed. The stairwell door opened and the light changed, and she was calculating the distance to the ground floor exit when Connor's phone rang and he answered it and stopped walking and his face did something she hadn't seen before. He went white, the same way Damien had gone white at the gala, the same sudden draining, the same catastrophic information arriving faster than the face could manage it. "Say that again," he said into the phone. Whoever was on the other end said it again. Connor lowered the phone. He looked at Seraphina with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not rage, not satisfaction, not any of the things she'd expected from him in this situation. Something that looked, if she was reading it correctly, almost like the expression of a man who had just realized the game was larger than the board he was playing on. "It seems," he said slowly, "that the FBI executed a warrant on Garrison's office 40 minutes ago." The stairwell was very quiet. "And they've named Damien as the primary subject of a financial crimes and homicide investigation." He looked at her. The expression was solidifying into something harder. "Homicide." Seraphina held his gaze and said nothing, and felt, in the specific cavity of her chest where the grief for Nikolai lived, something that was not satisfaction and was not relief, but was the cold, clean sensation of a structure clicking into place, the structure she'd built, the architecture of 5 years of patience and calculation, arriving at the moment it had been designed to arrive at. She thought, Lucian pulled the trigger. She thought, the submission went through. She thought, we have them. And then the older man's hand closed on her arm, hard, and Connor's expression finished its journey from shock to something considerably more dangerous. And she understood that the federal warrant, rather than freeing her, had just made her the only leverage Damien Cross had left, and that the people in this stairwell with her had just received the same information and arrived at the same. The older man's grip on her arm was the kind that left marks. She didn't pull against it. Pulling against that kind of grip was how you got a dislocated shoulder, and a dislocated shoulder was a variable she couldn't afford right now. She let him hold her, and she assessed the stairwell. Concrete walls, metal handrail, 3 flights to the ground floor, the cleaning crew somewhere below, the data processing office on the 2nd floor landing, which meant people, which meant witnesses, which meant the calculus of what Connor could and couldn't do in this building shifted depending on how many floors they were from a crowd. Connor was still looking at his phone. His jaw was tight. "Move," he said. Not to her, to the older man. They went down. She counted steps the way she'd been taught to count everything. Not obsessively, but as data, as spatial intelligence that might matter in 30 seconds or 3 minutes. 12 steps to the 2nd floor landing. The data processing office was behind a frosted glass door on the left. Through the glass, she could see the blue-white glow of monitor screens and the blurred shapes of 2, maybe 3 people. The older man's grip shifted at the landing, adjusting for the turn. She went through the frosted glass door. Not elegantly. She drove her weight sideways into the older man's arm, using the pivot point of the landing to break his grip at the moment it was weakest, mid-turn, when his leverage was split between keeping hold of her and navigating the stairs. His hand caught her sleeve instead of her arm, and the sleeve tore, and she was through the door before the younger man had processed what was happening. The data processing office was a long, fluorescent-lit room with 6 workstations and 3 people, 2 young women and a man in his 30s who looked up from his screen with the particular expression of someone whose night had been entirely ordinary until 11 seconds ago. Seraphina crossed the room in 8 strides and hit the far door and was in the corridor beyond it, and moving before the shouting from the stairwell had fully registered with anyone in the room. The corridor ran east-west. She went east because east was away from the stairwell and toward what the building diagram in her memory. She'd looked at Eastgate Commercial Properties 3 months ago for a completely different reason, and had not expected the information to be relevant tonight, suggested was a secondary fire exit near the building's rear service entrance. She heard the door behind her hit the wall. She ran. The fire exit was where she'd calculated it would be, which was the first thing to go right in the last 2 hours. She hit the push bar at full speed and the door gave, and the cold night air of the alley behind the textile building arrived like a physical slap. She went left, away from Wander Street, into the alley's dark toward the cross street beyond. Her heels were wrong for running. She'd worn them to the gala, which felt like it had been in a previous geological era, and they were Italian leather and 3 inches, and she got half a block before one caught a gap in the pavement, and she went down hard on both knees. The impact went through her like a current. She registered it. The hot bloom of pain from both kneecaps, the palms coming down on wet asphalt, the silk of the gown tearing along the left thigh. Registered it, and filed it, and got back up in the same motion, because stopping was not a variable. She reached the cross street and turned north, and there was a bodega on the corner with its lights on, and a man out front unloading a delivery truck, and she made a decision in a fraction of a second and walked toward him with the specific controlled pace of someone who is not running. "I need to use your phone," she said. The delivery man looked at her. $4,000 dress, torn hem, bleeding palms, no shoes because she'd shed the heels somewhere in the alley, with the expression of a man processing a significant amount of information at once. "Please," she said. "It's urgent." He handed her his phone without asking any further questions, which she would remember later as one of the genuinely decent things a stranger had done for her. She called Lucian's secondary number, not the primary, which was on her confiscated phone and which Connor's people would be monitoring, and he answered before the first ring completed, which meant he'd been waiting. "Where are you?" he said. "North side of the textile building, Wander and Cross Meridian." She was watching the alley mouth she'd come from. Nothing yet. "They have my phone. Connor is running point. He got the news about the warrant while I was with him." "I know. Reyes called me 40 minutes ago." A pause. "The submission went through at 3:52. The warrant was expedited because one of the Garrison associates attempted to destroy files when the investigation flag hit their firm's name. That accelerated everything by about 4 weeks. Harmon called his attorney at 2 a.m. His attorney called the federal line at 2:45. He's cooperating." Another pause. "Seraphina." "I know. We'll discuss what you did after you're out of the street." "Theo." "Theo is with Marek. He's fine. Connor's man stood down when the warrant news broke. Didn't want the exposure." A beat. "A car is 6 minutes from your position. Black, plates ending in 447. Get in it." She gave the delivery man his phone back and said thank you, and he nodded, and she stood on the corner of Wander and Cross Meridian and watched the alley and the street and felt her knees throbbing under the torn silk and waited. The car arrived in 5 minutes. She got in. The driver was a woman she'd never seen before. Late 20s, short hair, the compact efficiency of someone trained for this work. She didn't speak. She drove north and then west, away from the Eastgate district, and Seraphina sat in the back and looked at her palms, scraped raw, flecked with grit, starting to stiffen as the adrenaline began its long withdrawal. She thought about Connor's face when the warrant news arrived, the way the predator calculation had shifted in his eyes into something more complicated and more dangerous. A man who'd been operating from a position of structural advantage for his entire life, suddenly looking at a situation where the structure had changed without his permission. A cornered man was a different animal than a confident one. She thought about Damien receiving the same news. She thought about what he would do with it. The answer arrived before the thought finished. He would burn everything he could reach. The Meridian townhouse was different when she arrived. She felt it before she saw anything specific. A change in the operational temperature of the building, the way a house feels different when the people inside it are moving differently. Lucian was on the 3rd floor with 2 men she recognized as the senior tier of his operation, a woman named Frost, who handled communications, and a man called Waverly, who managed the cityside logistics network. Both of them had the alert, slightly compressed effect of people who'd been awake for the wrong number of hours and were running on professional discipline. Lucian looked at her when she came through the door. He looked at the torn dress and the palms and the knees. He looked at her face. He didn't say anything about any of it. Not yet. He turned back to the monitor wall and said, Victor Draven made contact with Cross Holdings at 11:48 tonight. We flagged it on the financial wire. A payment authorization through a Draven-affiliated account to a security consulting firm that operates as Draven's operational front in the Northeast. She crossed to the monitors. How much? 300,000. Advance payment structure, which means an ongoing engagement, not a single service. He turned to face her. Draven has been trying to move into Blackwater City for 2 years. I've blocked 3 separate attempts to establish territory in the Port District. He's been looking for a leverage point, and Damian Cross, facing federal homicide charges and the collapse of his financial empire, is the most available leverage point in the city right now. Damian made a deal with Draven. Damian is drowning, and he grabbed onto whatever was closest. Lucian's voice carried no judgment, just the flat topography of a man describing a situation. The arrangement, based on the payment structure and Draven's operational history, is almost certainly this. Draven provides Damian with the resources to remove the threat, us, and in exchange, Draven gets access to the Port District infrastructure that Cross Holdings has built over 15 years. Seraphina stood in front of the monitors and processed this. The Port District infrastructure, the shipping corridors, the warehouse networks, the customs facilitation relationships that Damian had spent a decade and a half building through political contributions and strategic hiring was worth 50 times the 300,000 advance. It was the kind of asset that could anchor an entire criminal operations northeast expansion. When? She said. The Founders Gala is in 4 days. She looked at him. It's already scheduled, he said. We're expected to attend. We confirmed 3 weeks ago. Draven will know that. He paused. It's the cleanest opportunity he'll have. A public venue, a known timeline, and the chaos of an event to work in. He's going to move at the gala. That's my assessment. She sat down at one of the workstations. Her knees were stiffening badly now, and she was aware of it with a removed clinical attention. She would deal with it later. She said, What are our options? We don't attend, Frost said from her station. Simple solution. No, Seraphina said. That signals retreat. The moment we don't show, Draven and Damian both read it as an admission that we can be pressured, and every relationship we've built in this city over 2 years recalibrates. She looked at Lucian. We have to be there. Lucian was watching her with the specific quality of attention he gave to things he had already decided about but wanted to hear articulated. Yes, he said. Then we don't walk in blind. No. We know it's coming. We know the venue. We know the timeline. We know some of it. He moved to the central monitor and pulled up a building schematic, the Astronova Hotel, the same venue that had hosted the charity gala, the same obsidian ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and its marble floors and its gold doors. The Founders Gala occupies all 4 event floors, 800 confirmed guests. Staff access runs through 6 service corridors. The building has 3 external entry points and 4 underground parking levels with direct elevator access to the event floors. Seraphina studied the schematic. She knew this building. She'd attended events here every year for the 4 years of her marriage. She knew the way the grand staircase created a natural bottleneck between the ballroom level and the upper private reception floors. She knew the service corridor configuration off the east wing. She knew the penthouse level where Damian had held his private dinners and where, in the last year of their marriage, she'd started noticing that the men at those dinners were not the kind of men who appeared on company boards. Damian will want to be on the upper floors, she said. He'll want a position above the main event. He'll watch from the penthouse level and let Draven's people operate below. That's consistent with his pattern, Waverly said. Then that's where I need to be. Lucien looked at her. No. Lucian, I need you on the main floor coordinating. You know the building, you know the social architecture, and you're the person in this operation who can move through 800 guests without triggering anyone's alarm response. His voice was level. I'll take the upper floors. She looked at him. She understood the logic. She also understood, with the specific knowledge of someone who had studied Lucien Moretti for 5 years at close range, that the upper floor was the most dangerous position, that he was allocating it to himself because he was what he was, and because sending anyone else to the penthouse level of this operation was a risk he wouldn't take. She understood, and she didn't argue, because arguing about it would cost time she didn't have and would change nothing. "All right," she said. He nodded once. Then, in a different register, quieter, stripped of operational language, he said, "Your brother." She looked at the schematic. "I should have told you 3 years ago," he said. "There isn't a version of that decision that I can defend to you on its merits. I made a calculation about what you needed and when, and the calculation was mine to make, and I was wrong to make it." A pause. "I'm sorry." She held the schematic in her field of vision and felt the sentence land. Lucienne Moretti did not apologize. She had never heard him apologize for anything in 5 years. She understood the weight of it, not as absolution, not as something that changed the geography of what had been withheld, but as a genuine accounting. He had done it, and he knew it was wrong, and he was saying so without dressing it in justification. "We'll talk about it after," she said, "when this is done." "Yes." "All of it." "Yes," he said again. They worked through the night and the following day and the day after that. The operational planning for the Founders Gala was the most complex thing Seraphina had been part of in 5 years of complex things. Lucienne's network ran 23 people in Blackwater City. Not a large number, but positioned with the precision of someone who understood that placement mattered more than volume. Each of the 23 had a role in the gala operation. 3 in the catering staff, 2 in building security through a placement that had been arranged 6 months earlier when the gala venue contracts were signed, 4 in vehicles covering the external perimeter, the rest distributed across the event floors in the civilian cover of attending guests. Seraphina mapped the social layer. 800 guests, and she knew or had history with perhaps 300 of them. She built a matrix. Who was loyal to Damien, who was transactional, who was genuinely neutral, and most importantly, who was the kind of person who would respond to visible chaos by moving toward the exits versus by pulling out their phone. The exit movers were the population she needed to manage. A stampede of 800 panicked socialites in a building where a firefight was potentially happening was a secondary catastrophe she needed to architect against. She worked on it until her eyes felt like they'd been rubbed with sandpaper, and her knees had stiffened into something she had to deliberately unlock with each step. She didn't sleep for 36 hours, and then she slept for 4 and woke up with the specific clarity of someone whose body has processed what it can and returned what's left. The night of the Founders Gala, Seraphina stood in front of the mirror in the Meridian Townhouse's 4th-floor room and looked at herself with the detached assessment she applied to operational variables. She was 36 years old. She had a 2-inch scar on her left palm from the fall on Wander Street that had closed cleanly but would leave something permanent. Her knees had faded from purple-black to green-yellow. She was wearing a deep navy gown. Not black, she'd made that specific choice. Black was the armor she'd worn for the entrance, and this night required something different, something that said, "I'm not here to announce myself, I'm here to finish something." Her hair was up. The diamond serpent was at her throat again. She looked like a woman who was not afraid. She was afraid. She understood the distinction well enough now to hold both things at once. The fear, which was real and appropriate and present in her body as a low electrical charge, and the forward motion, which was also real and which did not require the absence of fear to function. Lucienne had taught her that in the 2nd year. "Fear is data," he'd said. "It's telling you the stakes are real. Respect it. Don't obey it." She thought about Nikolai. She let herself think about him for 60 seconds. The birthday dinner, the bad coffee maker, the way he'd looked at Damien at that first meeting and said later quietly, "He watches you like something he's trying to keep." She held those 60 seconds, and then she put them where they needed to be. Not behind her, but in her, the way you carry something that has changed the shape of what you're walking toward. She went downstairs. Lucienne was in the operations room in a dark suit, reviewing the final positioning map with Waverly. He looked up when she came in. Something moved across his face that he didn't suppress. She'd learned to read the things he didn't suppress as the truest register. And then he turned back to the map. "Draven's people confirmed," Waverly said. "We have visual on 6 individuals who match the profile entering the Astronova in the last 90 minutes. 3 through the main entrance and guest cover, 2 through the catering access, one unaccounted for in the south parking structure. The unaccounted one is the problem, Lucetian said. Marek is on the parking levels. Tell Marek I want positive ID, not just a profile match. He rolled the map. We move in 40 minutes. Seraphina rode to the gala in the same black car with Theo, who had not said anything about the night at the textile building and who she suspected had been specifically instructed not to. He drove with the focused quiet of a man doing a job he'd agreed to and had thought carefully about and was going to see through. She appreciated it in a way she didn't have language for right now. The Astronova Hotel's entrance was lit in amber and white, the way it was lit for every major event. A particular quality of designed warmth that was neither welcoming nor cold, just expensive. Cars queued along the drop-off lane. Uniformed attendants moved with practiced efficiency. Above the entrance, the hotel rose 17 stories against the night sky. She got out of the car. The grand ballroom was everything it always was. The crystal chandeliers throwing light in fractured patterns across marble floors. The string quartet in the corner. The specific ambient register of 400 conversations happening at once, at a pitch calibrated to suggest intimacy while achieving volume. The bar ran along the east wall. The grand staircase rose from the north end of the room in a sweep of pale stone and wrought iron toward the upper floors. Seraphina moved through it and watched everything and touched nothing and spoke to the people she needed to speak to in the right order and at the right length, and the entire time her peripheral vision was mapping the room against the operational schematic in her head, tracking the 3 confirmed Draven placements she'd been briefed on, noting the positions of Lucien's people at their distributed stations, reading the crowd's temperature. The crowd's temperature was elevated. The Damien Cross federal investigation had broken in the press 2 days ago, not the full picture, but enough to have made the rounds. And 800 people who all had history with Damien Cross or his circle were doing the social calculation of what that history now meant and how visible it had been, and who else in this room was similarly calculating. It made for a particular ambient tension that was different from excitement, something more like the specific electricity of a room where everyone is waiting for the next piece of information and trying not to appear to be waiting. She was on her second circuit of the room when the call came through the earpiece. Frost's voice from the communications position. Upper floors, East Wing corridor. Waverly has eyes on 2 unknown individuals moving toward the penthouse access. Not staff, not guest, armed. Seraphina turned toward the grand staircase without breaking pace. Lucien's position? Penthouse level. He's been up there 20 minutes. Does he have the feed? He has it. She was at the base of the staircase. Around her, the gala continued its oblivious performance. Champagne, conversation, the string quartet moving into something with a minor key. She took the stairs at a pace that would read, to anyone watching, as simply a guest moving with purpose. She was 2 flights up when she heard, distantly but distinctly, the sound that changed everything. 2 shots, close together, from somewhere above. The string quartet stopped. The ballroom below erupted. Not immediately. There was a half-second of collective held breath, the room's animal consciousness processing what it had heard. And then the sound of glass breaking, and someone screaming, and then the cascade of 400 people's fight or flight responses activating simultaneously, which produced a noise like a wave breaking. Seraphina took the remaining stairs at a run. The penthouse level was 3 floors above the ballroom. By the time she came through the stairwell door into the corridor, she was breathing hard, her knees transmitting the impact of the stairs in sharp, specific pulses she catalogued and ignored. The corridor was empty and dim, the ambient lighting that the hotel ran during events, warm and low. And the door to the main penthouse reception room was open at the far end. She went through it. The room was a wreck of overturned furniture and broken glass. A man she didn't know was on the floor near the bar cart, not dead from the way he was moving, but not in useful condition. The large window at the far end of the room, the panoramic one that looked out over Blackwater City, had a spiderweb fracture in the lower left corner. Lucien was across the room. He was standing, which she registered as the most important single piece of information in the room. He was standing and his jacket was off, and there was blood on his shirt on the left side in the specific location that meant ribs, maybe more. He was holding his phone and looking at the cracked window with the expression of a man completing a calculation. "How bad?" she said. Manageable. He looked at her. Victor Draven was in this room 20 minutes ago. Was. He left when the backup he was expecting didn't arrive. Marek found the south parking placement. A pause that cost him something. She could see it in the controlled quality of his breathing. Draven had 3 people up here. 2 are down. 1 left with him. He's still in the building. He's still in the building, and he's lost his operational advantage, and a man like Draven, in a building that's now going to be full of law enforcement in approximately 9 minutes, is going to make one more move before he tries to exit. Lucien looked at her steadily. 1 target remaining that gives this operation any value to him. She understood. Damien? If Draven kills Damien before federal custody, Damien can't cooperate. The deal Draven made with him is void, but the information Damien has about Draven's operations dies with him. Lucien picked up his jacket. If Damien survives to federal custody, he trades everything he knows about every criminal relationship he's had for reduced charges, which means he trades what he knows about Draven. Draven needs him dead. Within the next 8 minutes. Below them, through the floor, the ballroom had reached full chaos. She could hear it as a continuous wave of sound, the kind that had no individual components anymore. She heard what might have been more gunfire from the direction of the East Wing. She heard sirens already, which meant someone had called early or the federal team had been staged and was moving. "Where's Damien?" she said. Lucien looked at her. "The East Penthouse corridor. He came up 20 minutes ago. I think he was meeting with Draven. When the shooting started, he ran toward the service access at the end of the East Wing." A pause. "He's cornered." Seraphina was already moving. "Seraphina." His voice carried the weight of everything they hadn't said yet. The deferred conversation about Nikolai, about the night at the Callaway building, about the 5 years of building something together that was now arriving at its terminal point in a hotel corridor with sirens outside. She stopped. She looked back at him. "Come back from this," he said. It wasn't an instruction, it was something else. The specific 3 words of a man who did not speak in that register about things he hadn't decided to be certain of. She held it for 1 second. Then she turned and went down the east corridor at a run, toward the sound of a man who had ordered her brother's death running out of places to hide. And the sirens grew louder through the hotel's walls, and the chandeliers in the ballroom below were swaying from the vibration of 400 people moving at once. And somewhere in the East Wing, Damien Cross was at the end of a corridor of his own making with nowhere left to. The east corridor of the penthouse level ran 90 feet from the main reception room to the service access door at the far end, and every one of those 90 feet was lit by the hotel's amber event lighting that had been designed to flatter and now just made everything look like the inside of something burning. Seraphina ran it in heels she should have shed 2 floors ago and didn't because there was no time. Her knees transmitted every impact in clear, specific language. Her breathing was controlled, not calm, controlled, which was different, which was the thing Lucien had spent 2 years teaching her, and which she understood now not as a technique, but as something structural, something she'd built into herself in the same way you build load-bearing walls. She heard Damien before she saw him. He was at the service door at the end of the corridor, and the service door was locked or jammed or both, and he was doing something to the handle with the focused desperation of a man who has run out of directions. He heard her footsteps and spun around. He looked the way she'd always known he would look at the end, not the charcoal suit version, not the courtroom smirk or the ballroom performance. He looked like the thing underneath all of that, a man in his mid-40s with sweat soaking through his collar and his jaw working on nothing, and his eyes doing the rapid calculation of someone whose every prepared response has just become useless. He looked, she thought, small, not physically. He was still the same height, still had the same jaw she'd once found compelling, but the architecture of his authority, the thing that made rooms rearrange themselves around him, that made judges look away and executives sweat, and Connor sharpen himself into whatever shape Damien needed. All of it had been load-bearing on something she couldn't see from inside the marriage, and could see clearly now, from here, in this amber corridor with the sirens rising through the walls. It had been load-bearing on the belief that no one would ever actually come. Seraphina. Her name in his mouth, for the first time in 5 years. He said it the way people say the name of something they thought they'd made safe. "The federal team is 3 floors below us," she said. She stopped 15 feet from him, close enough to read his face, far enough that the distance was a choice. "They're moving up the main staircase. You have maybe 6 minutes before this corridor isn't private anymore." He looked at the locked service door behind him. He looked at the corridor behind her, the way she'd come, the only way in or out. He looked at her. "You did this," he said. "Yes." "The documents, the federal contact." He was breathing through his nose in the specific way of a man trying to project steadiness he doesn't have. "How long?" 2 years of active operation, 5 years of intention. Something moved across his face. Not admiration, not quite, but something in the register of recognition. The acknowledgement that the person across from him had done something real. She'd spent 4 years watching him give that expression to men at private dinners when they brought him information he found genuinely impressive. And she understood that receiving it now, in this context, meant something specific about the kind of man he was. That even here, even cornered, some part of him was still evaluating. "I want to know something," she said. "Before the federal team gets here, I want to know if you knew. When you had Nikolai killed, I want to know if you understood what you were taking." His jaw moved. He looked at the floor for a moment. "He was going to destroy everything I built," he said. He had a contact at the DA's office. He'd already started making calls about the trust structure 2 months before the divorce filing. He looked up at her. "He wasn't just your brother. He was an active threat." "He was 33 years old," she said. "He had a coffee maker he'd owned since college." Damien's jaw tightened. "Did you know," she said again, "what he was to me? Whether losing him would break something that couldn't be rebuilt." A pause. He looked at her with the specific directness that had been one of the first things she'd noticed about him, 12 years ago at a fundraiser when he'd crossed the room to introduce himself, and looked at her like she was the most interesting thing in it. She understood now what that quality of attention actually was. Not interest exactly, more like the focus of a man assessing the load-bearing properties of something he was considering using. "Yes," he said. "I knew." She held that. She let it exist in the air between them without flinching from it. She'd known the answer before she asked. She'd asked because there was a version of this ending where Damien said something that allowed ambiguity, where he claimed calculation without cruelty, strategy without full knowledge of what he was destroying. She'd needed to know if that version existed. It didn't. "All right," she said. He watched her. "What happens now?" "Now the federal team comes up the stairs and you go into custody, and Harmon's testimony and Garrison's documents and the trust filings and the memo from page 31 of the archived records put you in front of a judge for the rest of your useful life." She paused. "And the judge will actually read the evidence this time because this judge wasn't paid to look away. And you. I walk out of here. Just like that. Just like that." He looked at her for a long moment. The corridor was very quiet except for the sirens and the distant layered sound of the ballroom 3 floors below, still working its way through chaos. He looked at her the way you look at something you've lost and are only now understanding the actual dimensions of. "I should have," he started. "Don't," she said. He stopped. "Don't do that," she said. Not hard, not theatrical, just clear. "Don't stand at the end of everything you chose and perform the version of yourself that chose differently. I don't want it, and you don't mean it, and we're past the point where it costs you anything to offer it." His mouth closed. The service door at his back rattled. Not from him, from the other side. Someone moving through the service level below. Her body identified it as a variable before her mind caught up, and her mind caught up fast. Victor Draven came through the service door. He must have found another access point, a parallel service shaft, a maintenance ladder, something that the operational schematic hadn't fully accounted for. He was a large man, broad through the chest, with the physical density of someone who'd survived things that should have been fatal. He had a gun, and he had blood on the left side of his face from something that had happened somewhere else in this building in the last 20 minutes, and he had the specific focused attention of a man who has reduced a complex situation to a single remaining task. He looked at Damien. He raised the gun. Seraphina moved without deciding to move. She crossed the 15 feet between her and Damien in the time it took Draven to register her trajectory, and she hit Damien's left side at the shoulder and took both of them down and sideways, and the shot went through the space where Damien's chest had been a half-second earlier and took out the amber light fixture on the wall behind them and plunged 20 feet of corridor into relative dark. She landed on her shoulder on the carpet with Damien's weight partly on her, and the impact went through the damaged knees and up her spine in a wave she registered and immediately overrode. She was already rolling. She was already moving away from where she'd been because the first thing you did in darkness with a shooter was not stay where you'd been. Draven was adjusting his position. She could hear it. The specific sound of a large man moving through limited space, the controlled breathing of someone who had done this before and knew how to do it in the dark. She didn't have a weapon. This was the specific consequence of improvised operations that Lucien had articulated, and she had heard and had gone into the textile building anyway. She had no weapon, and she was on the floor of a dark corridor with a man who wanted Damien dead badly enough to come up through a service shaft in a building full of incoming law enforcement, and the only thing she had was the dark and the geography, and the fact that she knew this hotel in ways that Draven, who had come from outside, did not. She thought about the floor plan. She thought about the amber lighting and the location of the failed fixture and the distance between where she was and the main corridor door she'd come through. She thought about the service door Draven had come from and whether it had swung closed on its spring mechanism. She heard Damien moving somewhere to her right, still alive, trying to find the service door or the wall or something to orient against. Draven moved toward the sound. Draven. Her voice from her position on the floor, deliberately thrown leftward. A technique that worked better in theory than practice, but was what she had. The federal tactical team is on this floor. He stopped. I can hear them, she said. Not a lie. She could hear movement in the stairwell through the wall to her left. You put one more shot in this corridor, and there are 8 armed federal agents who will orient on the sound in a building they're already clearing. Silence. 3 seconds. Walk away from this, she said. Damien Cross in federal custody is your problem. Damien Cross dead in this corridor means nothing except they add the charge to the rest of what you're already carrying. She heard her own breathing and steadied it. You can't shoot your way out of this building. There are too many of them, and you know it. But you can walk out of a service exit in the next 3 minutes if you move now. More silence. She heard him make the calculation. She heard it in the quality of the dark, the way the silence changed when a man decides something. He went back through the service door. She lay on the floor of the corridor for 2 full seconds and let her body report what it knew. Both knees, her shoulder, her palms, the ribs on the left side that had caught the edge of the fall and were telling her something she'd deal with later. She was breathing. Everything critical was functioning. She got up. Damien was against the far wall, sitting on the floor with his back to the baseboard and his knees up and his hands loose in his lap. The emergency lighting from the remaining fixtures made him look the way things looked when you took the expensive casing off. Just materials. Just the basic components of a person without the design. She stood over him and looked down. You saved my life, he said. His voice was strange, stripped of all its registers, the warmth and the authority and the social mechanism. Just a voice, just a man talking. I needed you alive for the testimony, she said. It wasn't entirely true. She didn't examine what the other part was, not right now. Maybe later she would sit with the specific complexity of having chosen to pull him out of a bullet's path after everything he had chosen, and she would try to understand what that said about who she was. Not tonight. The stairwell door at the end of the corridor burst open and 3 federal agents came through in tactical formation, weapons raised, flashlights cutting the amber dark. Someone was shouting instructions and someone else was on a radio, and the whole machinery of consequence that had been set in motion weeks ago was arriving at its physical location, here, in this corridor, in this hotel, in this city. She raised both hands. Seraphina Vale, she said, clearly, in the practiced voice of someone who had rehearsed this specific moment, because preparation was what you did. I'm unarmed. The subject is Damien Cross. He's against the far wall. One of the agents crossed to Damien. The other 2 stayed on her, weapons not lowered. Are there other individuals on this floor? The senior agent said. Victor Draven exited through the service shaft approximately 90 seconds ago. He was armed and injured. He went down. She kept her hands up and her breathing even. There's also an injured individual in the main penthouse reception room. He needs medical. The radio crackled. The agent's postures shifted, information coming in from other floors, the broader picture of the building assembling itself through their earpieces. Slowly, by degrees, the weapons came down. She stood with her hands in the air and listened to Damien Cross being read his rights, and she felt nothing theatrical about it. No triumph, no release, not the cathartic swell that the story was supposed to produce at this moment. She felt tired. She felt the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been able to put it down, which was not the same as joy. It was just the absence of the weight and the awareness of all the places the body had compensated. She felt Nikolai's absence, which she would feel for the rest of her life, and which would not get easier so much as it would become part of the landscape, the way a scar becomes part of the skin, present, permanent, eventually just part of what you're made of. She lowered her hands. Lucien was on the main floor when she came back down the staircase. He was with two of the federal agents, not in custody, but in conversation, the specific quality of conversation that men like Lucien had with law enforcement, which operated in a space that was neither cooperation nor confrontation, but something more pragmatic than either. She caught his eye across the ballroom. He looked at her hands, her face, the shoulder. He did his assessment in 3 seconds, the way he did everything, efficiently and completely. And then the conversation with the agents continued, and she moved to the east wall and stood with her back to the marble and waited. The ballroom was wrecked in the specific way that panicked crowds wreck things. Chairs overturned, abandoned champagne flutes in unexpected places, a long smear of something across the marble near the staircase base where someone had fallen. The crystal chandeliers were still lit. The string quartet's instruments were on the floor where their players had abandoned them in the evacuation. Outside, through the gold doors that stood open to the autumn night, she could see the blue and red of tactical lights, and the organized activity of a situation being professionally managed. She sat down on the floor against the east wall. She sat there because her knees had said that was what was happening now, and she had run out of the specific kind of authority that overrides what the body says. She sat on the marble floor of the Astronova Hotel's obsidian ballroom in a navy gown that had cost $4,000 and was now missing a significant portion of its left side. And she sat with her damaged palms on her thighs and her back against the wall, and she breathed. She thought about a hotel room in the garment district 5 years ago. The shower running, the tile floor, the specific quality of that emptiness. She thought about the bus going through 12 states, the flat western sky, the diner counter and the styrofoam cups, and a man who'd said it starts with information. She thought about Nikolai at the birthday dinner, laughing at something she'd said, pouring wine badly so it ran down the outside of the glass and saying, "I've been pouring wine for 15 years, I don't know why it still does that." She thought about that laugh. She thought about how she hadn't called him from the courthouse because some instinct had warned her, and how she'd understood later that the instinct had been right, but that being right about a warning you didn't act on was its own particular grief. She thought, I came back. I built what I said I would build. I burned what I said I would burn. She thought, he still doesn't get his 30 years back. She didn't cry, not here, later, probably, in a room without witnesses, the way she'd always done it, but not here, not on this floor, not with the tactical lights still flashing through the open doors and the federal agents still moving through the upper floors. She sat, and she breathed, and she let the building hold her weight for a while. Lucien found her 20 minutes later. He came across the empty ballroom. The agents had moved most of their operation to the upper floors and the exterior, and the main room was temporarily inhabited only by wreckage and light. And he sat down beside her on the floor. Not across from her. Beside her, back against the same wall, the same posture, the same quality of exhaustion that had the dignity of being genuine rather than performed. His left side was bandaged under the shirt. She could see the slight stiffness in how he settled against the wall. Field job, she guessed. Whoever had done it quickly. They sat in silence for a while. Draven, she said. He exited through the south parking structure. 2 of Marek's people picked him up on the perimeter. He's in federal custody. A pause. He was already wounded when he came out. He'd been in a firefight on the service level. Another pause. He'll be charged federally. His operations in the Northeast are finished. And Connor. Blackwater PD took him at the hotel entrance at some point during the evacuation. He had a firearm in the vehicle he arrived in. They're processing him currently. He paused. The charges will expand when the full picture of the Vale Cross trust structure becomes evidentiary. Garrison is already cooperating. Apparently, he decided within about 40 minutes of the warrant that his client's interests and his own had diverged significantly. She almost smiled. 40 minutes! He's a practical man. She looked across the empty ballroom. The abandoned instruments, the overturned chairs, the chandeliers still throwing their fractured light across all of it. There was something almost funny about the chandeliers, still lit, still performing their function, indifferent to what had happened beneath them. I broke your rule, she said, the night at the textile building. I went in when you said stay in the car. Yes. It nearly cost us everything. It did cost things, he said. The clean timeline, the operational security we'd maintained for 2 years. He said it without accusation. Just the ledger, read aloud. It also accelerated the federal submission by approximately 4 weeks because I made the decision to move the moment your location signal deviated, which meant Harmon had less time to transfer his holdings and felt more pressure to cooperate. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not telling you it was the right decision. I'm telling you that the consequences of wrong decisions are sometimes complicated. I needed to know about Nikolai from you, she said. I needed that not to come from a memo. He turned his head and looked at her. I know, he said. I was wrong. She held that. He'd said it once before, upstairs, and it had the same quality both times. The specific weight of words from a man who chose them with the care of someone who understood they had mass. She thought about what it meant to have spent 5 years beside a person who was fundamentally his own kind of damaged, shaped by whatever had made him what he was, capable of calculation where other people had feeling, and yet not without something underneath the calculation that had, over 5 years and at close range, become impossible to mistake for nothing. She thought about Arroyo Seco, the bad coffee, the plastic chairs, the flat western light. A man who had said, I'm not here to make your life harder in the middle of the worst period of her life, and who had meant it in the specific way that someone means something they've already decided before they say it. She thought about the 5 years between that moment and this floor. I need to find out what's left of Nikolai's estate, she said. Whatever he had, the apartment, the work from the Bridger show, if any of his paintings are in storage somewhere. She paused. I need to do something with his things. We'll find them, Lucien said. Not I'll help you find them. Not we can look into that. Just we'll find them, which was its own kind of statement, the kind that didn't announce itself but had structural weight. She looked at the chandeliers. He would have hated you, she said. Initially, he would have thought you were exactly the kind of trouble he'd been warning me about. He would have been right. He would have come around eventually. He could read people. She felt the specific texture of talking about Nikolai in the past tense, which she'd been doing internally for weeks but hadn't done aloud, and found that it was different spoken, heavier and also somehow more real, more present. He would have seen the parts of you that aren't the parts you lead with. Lucia said nothing. She didn't need him to. They sat on the marble floor until a federal agent came to tell them that their official statements would be needed within the hour. And they both stood up with the particular care of people working around specific recent damage. And Seraphina smoothed what was left of the navy gown, and Lucien retrieved his jacket from somewhere. And they walked together through the gold doors of the Astronova Hotel into the cold autumn air of Blackwater City. The night outside was chaotic in the managed way that large police operations were chaotic. Organized, purposeful, the chaos of a machine with many parts all functioning toward a defined outcome. Blue and red lights swept the front of the hotel in repeating patterns. News crews had gathered at the press line half a block east. Federal vehicles were staged in the taxi lane. People in tactical gear moved with the unhurried efficiency of professionals who had done this before. Seraphina stood on the hotel's front steps for a moment and let the cold air work on her face. It smelled like autumn and exhaust, and somewhere, faintly, the river. Blackwater City smelled like Blackwater City, which it always had. Specific, dense, the smell of a place that had been accumulating itself for a long time and had no plans to stop. She'd grown up across the bridge, in the Riverside neighborhood where the buildings were shorter and the streets were wider and the city looked like something you could understand from inside it. She'd moved into the city proper at 22, after the first job, after she'd understood that she was going to make something here or not at all. She'd built what she'd built. She'd lost it. She'd left. She'd come back. She wasn't the same person who'd stood outside the courthouse in the rain. She understood that with the clear-eyed honesty of someone who'd had 5 years and a great deal of evidence to work with. The woman on the courthouse steps had been genuinely good at things, but had fundamentally trusted the world to be structured the way she'd been told it was. The woman on these steps understood that the world was structured the way the people with the most leverage built it, and that leverage was acquirable, and that the people who built the current structure had not anticipated that she was going to spend 5 years learning how. She also understood that the woman on these steps was harder than the one who'd stood in the rain, and that this was necessary and also a cost, and that some costs were worth paying and some were just costs. She thought, I don't know yet which kind this one is. She thought, I have time to find out. A federal agent in plain clothes came up the steps toward them, mid-40s, face she didn't recognize. He looked at Lucien first, then at her, and said, Ms. Vale, I'm with the Financial Crimes Division. I'll be taking the preliminary statement when you're ready. I'm ready now, she said. She gave the statement in a conference room they'd set up in the hotel's administrative offices, at a table with a federal seal folder and 3 agents and a recorder, and she told them what she knew in the precise language she'd been preparing for 2 years. Not everything, and not in the order that would create problems for what she and Lucien needed to preserve, but enough. More than enough. Enough to close the cross-examination on Damien's primary financial crimes and connect Garrison directly to the trust manipulation and establish the timeline on the judge payments. When they got to Nikolai, she told them that too. She said his name, Nikolai Vale, and she gave them Creel's name and Dario's information and the memo reference and the file location, and she said it all in the level professional voice she'd been using for an hour. And she didn't stop when the agent across from her adjusted his expression and said, Take your time in the gentle way people said it when they thought you were going to need it. She didn't need it. She said it all, and she said it clearly, and she did not look away from the recorder on the table, because Nikolai had not had anyone to say his name in a room where it would be documented, and now he did. And that was what she could give him, and she gave it completely. The statement took 2 hours. By the time she walked out of the administrative offices and back through the hotel's side corridor into the pre-dawn lobby, the building had achieved the particular quiet of a place where something large has happened and the large thing is over. The tactical teams were gone. The news vans remained outside, would remain for days, but inside the hotel there was just the wreckage and the staff beginning the first tentative gestures of restoration. A woman in a uniform stacking chairs, a man with a dolly moving broken equipment. Lucien was in the lobby. He'd given his statement separately, which was standard and expected, and which both of them had understood would be the arrangement without needing to discuss it. He was standing near the window that looked out onto the street, his jacket on now, the stiffness in his left side visible only if you knew to look. She crossed the lobby. Draven will take a plea, she said. By next week, he agreed. His operations here are done. And the port district stays clear. He looked at her. I'll need to have several conversations in the next month about what that means for the structure going forward. Some things will change. She understood what that meant. The operational geography of Blackwater City, reshaped by the removal of 2 significant players, would need to be renegotiated. Lucien would be part of that negotiation in the way he was always part of such things, present, unhurried, holding more information than anyone else in the room. She would probably not be part of it. The understanding arrived gently, without drama. She stood in the lobby of the Astronova Hotel at 5 in the morning and recognized that the thing they had built together, the 5-year project of specific intent, the operation that had just completed its function, had been a defined structure with a defined purpose, and the purpose was now achieved. What came after that was a different thing, and she didn't yet know its shape. She didn't know exactly what she was going to do with Blackwater City now that Damien's architecture had been demolished. She had the beginnings of thoughts. the legal avenues that would return portions of what had been taken, the professional reputation that would need to be rebuilt in conditions she hadn't existed in for 5 years, the specific project of recovering Nikolai's estate and doing something with it that honored what he'd been. She had the beginnings of a life that wasn't organized around an objective. She found she wasn't afraid of that. Uncertain, yes. Aware of the unfamiliarity, but not afraid. Fear was data. The data was telling her the stakes were real. She respected it. She didn't obey it. "Come on," Lucian said. They walked out of the hotel into the early morning of Blackwater City, and the air was cold, and the news vans were there, and she pulled her jacket closed and didn't look at the cameras. And Theo was at the curb with the car, and she got in, and Lucienne got in beside her, and the door closed, and the city resumed its function around them as it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of its own unfinished business. 3 weeks later, Seraphina stood in a storage unit in the Crossroads district and looked at Nikolai's paintings. There were 14 of them, work from the last 2 years of his life, which the building manager had held in lieu of unpaid storage fees, and which Seraphina had purchased for a figure that was much less than they were worth, and which would not be a figure anyone could attach to the transaction because she'd paid it in cash, because some things you did not want documented. The paintings were large, most of them, the scale he'd preferred, big enough that you had to step back to see them properly. She'd forgotten how good they were. She'd known it when he was alive. In the abstract way you know things about people close to you before you've learned to see them as the world sees them. But standing here in the storage unit's fluorescent light, she could see them as objects, as things that existed independent of her knowledge of who'd made them. And they were very good. The color and the tension in them, the sense of something unresolved held in suspension. They looked like work that knew it was being made under pressure and had incorporated the pressure rather than trying to transcend it. She stood in front of the largest one for a long time. It was a cityscape, not Blackwater specifically, or not only, a city seen from above and at an angle, rendered in blues and grays with a long horizontal line of orange near the bottom that might have been traffic or water or the specific color of a sky at the end of something. She didn't know when he'd made it. She thought it might have been recent. Something in the quality of the light in it felt recent. She thought about Nikolai carrying his coffee maker through 4 apartments. She thought about him at the birthday dinner, pouring wine badly and laughing about it. She thought about the show at the Bridger Gallery that had gotten a write-up in the arts section, in which she'd attended and stood in front of his work and felt proud in the specific way you felt proud of people you loved. She thought about the things she couldn't give him back. She thought about them fully, without looking away, because she'd decided that was what she owed him. Not the managed grief of someone protecting themselves from the full weight, but the actual weight. All of it. She stood in the storage unit and held it, and it was very heavy, and she didn't put it down. After a while, she called the Bridger Gallery. The director answered on the 3rd ring, a woman named Paulette, who'd known Nikolai and who was. Seraphina gathered quickly, genuinely pleased to hear from someone with his work. "I'd like to discuss a show," Seraphina said. "A retrospective. Whatever he left, all of it." A pause. "I want people to see what he made." That conversation took 40 minutes, and she had it sitting on the floor of the storage unit, her back against the cold metal wall, the paintings arranged in their fluorescent light around her. It was a beginning. Not the beginning she'd planned, not the one she'd imagined standing in the rain outside a courthouse 5 years ago. A different one. Smaller and more specific and more hers, built from the actual materials of what she'd survived rather than from what she'd wanted to recover. She'd wanted a lot of things at the start of this. She'd wanted the shares and the penthouse and her name restored to the company she'd helped build. She'd wanted the accounting, so the public, documented, irrefutable accounting of what Damien Cross had done. She'd wanted to stand somewhere and have it be known. She'd wanted the version of winning that looked like everything taken back. She'd gotten the accounting. The rest of it was gone, had been gone for 5 years, and what she understood now was that the 5 years had built something else in its place. Not better, not worse. Different. Harder and more functional and less innocent, and inhabited by a different person than the one who'd needed the penthouse and the shares back to feel like she'd won. The woman on the floor of the storage unit wasn't sure what winning looked like anymore. She knew what surviving looked like. She knew what doing the work looked like. She knew what it looked like to build something with your hands out of the specific materials available to you rather than the ones you'd been promised. She thought that might be enough. It wasn't a comfortable thought. It didn't arrive with music or light or the clean feeling of something resolved. It arrived the way true things arrived, quietly, without announcement, in a moment that looked from the outside like a woman sitting on a cold floor with her back against a metal wall, talking to a gallery director about a dead man's paintings. She finished the call. She sat for another minute in the quiet of the storage unit, in the fluorescent light, with Nikolai's work around her. Then she got up. She pulled the storage unit door down behind her and walked out into the Crossroads district, the neighborhood where her brother had lived and worked and carried his coffee maker through 4 moves. And the morning was gray and cold, and the city was doing what cities did, which was continuing. The street was wet from overnight rain. A woman was walking a dog. Someone had left a bicycle locked to a sign pole with a basket full of dry leaves. Seraphina walked to the end of the block and stood at the corner and looked at the city. Blackwater City looked back at her, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had. It did not acknowledge what had happened inside it in the last weeks. It did not register the specific weight of what one woman had built and broken and rebuilt in the years since it had watched her get shoved into the rain and written her off as a cautionary tale. It was just a city. She pulled her jacket closed against the cold. She walked.